Imagine waking up one morning and you cannot stop moving. Not trembling, not twitching from cold, dancing. Your legs carry you forward. You don't want them to. You didn't ask them to, but they move anyway, rhythmically, compulsively, with a terrible mechanical grace. You've been doing this for hours, maybe longer. Your feet are bleeding. Your heart is hammering. Every muscle in your body is screaming at you to stop. But you cannot stop. This is not a story about one woman. In the summer of 1518, in the walled city of Strasbourg, one of the most prosperous cities in the Holy Roman Empire, hundreds of people began dancing uncontrollably, involuntarily. They danced for days, some for weeks, and then they started dying. In the summer of 1518, something happened in Strasbourg that historians, doctors, and psychologists are still arguing about today. More than 500 years later, we don't have a clean answer, and that is what makes this story so deeply, genuinely unsettling. Because here is what we know for certain. At least 400 people danced against their will. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Some suffered heart attacks. Contemporaries reported that at the height of the outbreak, people were dying at a rate of several per day. The authorities didn't call for prayer. They didn't call for quarantine. They did something so bizarre, so counterintuitive, that when you first hear it, you think I'm joking. They hired musicians and built a stage. In this video, we're going to go back to Strasbourg, 1518. We're going to meet the woman who started it all. We're going to feel the terror that gripped an entire city, and we're going to follow the science, from medieval doctors to modern neurologists, as they attempt to explain the unexplainable. By the end of this video, you'll have the best answer we currently have, but I want to warn you, it raises questions that are even more disturbing than the dancing itself, questions that are relevant right now, today, in the world we're living in. Let's begin. Strasbourg, 1518. To understand why this happened, you first need to understand where it happened and when. Because the time and the place matter enormously. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city under enormous pressure. It sat at a critical crossroads of European trade, wealthy, densely populated, politically important. But beneath that prosperity, something was rotting. The previous decade had been catastrophic for ordinary people in the region. Repeated crop failures had caused famine. The plague had returned, as it always seemed to. Syphilis, a relatively new and terrifying disease, was spreading through the population. And the gap between the wealthy merchant class and the desperately poor had never felt wider or more cruel. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 were, in many ways, people at their absolute limit, surviving, barely, carrying grief and terror and hunger in their bodies every single day. Remember that. It's going to matter a great deal later. Frau Trophäa. On a morning in mid-July, 1518, the exact date lost to history, a woman named Frau Trophäa stepped into the street outside her home in Strasbourg. We don't know much about her. We don't know her age. We don't know if she had children. We don't know what her life looked like before that morning. History has swallowed those details whole. What we do know is this. She began to dance. Not in celebration, not in worship, in a kind of frantic rhythmic trance that confused everyone who saw it. Her husband tried to stop her. She couldn't stop. Neighbors gathered. She kept going. She danced through the morning, through the afternoon. As the sun set behind the cathedral spires of Strasbourg, Frau Trophäa was still dancing. Her feet were bleeding. Her breath was ragged, but her body would not stop. She danced for 4 to 6 days straight. Contemporary accounts suggest she was eventually brought to the shrine of Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers, and crucially of those suffering from what was then called Saint Vitus's dance, a convulsive disorder that caused uncontrollable movement. Whether the pilgrimage helped, the records don't tell us. What the records do tell us is what happened in the weeks that followed. The spread. Within 1 week of Frau Trofea's outbreak, approximately 34 other people had joined her. They hadn't decided to. They hadn't chosen to. They simply started. A man dancing outside the cathedral steps. A woman near the butcher's quarter, spinning until she vomited, and then spinning again. A teenager near the river who'd been dancing for 2 days by the time anyone thought to write it down. By the end of the first month, August 1518, the number of afflicted had exploded. Some sources put the figure at 100, some say 400 or more. Think about that. Hundreds of people in a single medieval city dancing against their will. The sight must have been extraordinary, horrifying. Picture the city square on a hot August afternoon, dozens of bodies writhing and swaying, some weeping, some silent, some crying out for help, none of them able to stop. The smell of sweat and blood, the sound of feet on stone, the absence of music. There was no music. They were dancing to nothing.
Let me be specific about what the dancing was doing to these people's bodies, because it wasn't just exhausting, it was destroying them. Prolonged, uncontrolled physical exertion causes a cascade of medical crises. The heart, pushed far beyond its capacity, can suffer permanent damage or simply stop. The kidneys begin to fail from dehydration and muscle breakdown. The tendons in the feet and ankles, not designed for continuous weight-bearing movement, begin to tear. Ankles swell to grotesque sizes. Skin blisters and peel from feet already raw from stone. Contemporary records note that many victims' shoes filled with blood, that some collapsed and had to be physically restrained, and still their legs kept moving on the ground, that some called out to God for relief that didn't come. And then the deaths began. Contemporary sources claim that at the peak of the outbreak, Strasbourg was losing up to 15 people per day to the dancing. 15 per day, from heart failure, from stroke, from sheer catastrophic exhaustion. The city of Strasbourg, a city of wealth, of commerce, of culture, was watching its people die from dancing, and nobody knew how to make it stop. Panic and chaos. The authorities react. The City Council of Strasbourg convened in emergency session. We know this because the records survive. The minutes of their meetings are preserved in the Strasbourg archives, and they make for remarkable reading. The physicians were consulted. And here is where things get interesting, because the physicians actually ruled out 2 of the most obvious explanations almost immediately. They decided the dancing was not caused by supernatural forces, and they decided it was not caused by the stars, despite astrology being a legitimate medical framework at the time. Their conclusion? The dancing was caused by overheated blood, by what they called a natural disease, by a medical condition of the body, not the soul. In an era when nearly everything unexplainable was attributed to God or the devil or the alignment of planets, the Strasbourg physicians made a secular medical diagnosis, and they did so within weeks of the outbreak beginning. That is by any measure remarkable. Their recommended treatment was equally remarkable and equally baffling. The decision that changed everything. The City Council of Strasbourg, acting on medical advice, made a decision that seems, by any modern standard, completely insane. They decided that the afflicted needed to keep dancing, that the cure for uncontrolled dancing was more dancing. Structured dancing, supervised dancing, dancing with professional musicians and a dedicated venue. They hired musicians, drummers, pipers, horn players. They brought in professional dancers to guide the afflicted. They commandeered the guild halls, the great meeting halls of the Strasbourg trade guilds, and opened them as dedicated dancing venues. They even erected a stage in the public square. The theory, as best historians can reconstruct it, was this: if the victims were forced to dance continuously, properly, with music, with rhythm, they would eventually dance themselves out of the illness, that the overheated blood would be expelled through the effort. They were trying to cure dancing with dancing. And here is the thing that will haunt you. It probably made things worse. By providing music, by providing rhythm, historians believe the city council may have given the dancers' compulsion something to latch onto, something to synchronize with. Rather than burning out, the dancing intensified. More people began dancing, not fewer.
Imagine living in Strasbourg that August. Imagine what it meant to step outside and see your neighbors, your friends, your family moving in that terrible, vacant way, moving and bleeding and crying. Contemporary diaries describe a city gripped by terror, not just of the dancing itself, but of catching it. People began avoiding public spaces. The market, the economic heart of the city, grew quiet. Parents kept children indoors. Priests held emergency masses. And then came the accusations. Because when people are terrified and confused, they look for someone to blame. Whispers began circulating that the dancing was a curse, that someone had brought this evil on the city, that a witch was responsible, or a heretic, or someone who had sinned so gravely that God had unleashed this punishment on an entire community. The social fabric of Strasbourg, already stretched thin by years of famine and disease, was beginning to tear. And then, around the same time, someone noticed something strange, something that nobody in the city council had thought to track until it was impossible to ignore. Almost all the dancers were poor. The pattern in the chaos. Of the hundreds afflicted, the vast majority came from the lower classes of Strasbourg society, the laboring poor, the destitute, the people already ground down by years of famine, illness, and economic desperation. Wealthy merchants were not dancing. Guildmasters were not dancing. The bishop and his court were not dancing. It was the poor, the suffering, the forgotten. Now, that could be a coincidence. The wealthy had better nutrition, better shelter, better access to whatever medical care existed. Maybe they were simply more physically resilient. Or maybe, and this is a theory we'll return to, the dancing wasn't really about the body at all. Maybe it was about something else entirely. Something buried so deep in the human mind that it can sometimes only escape through the body. Death, fear, and supernatural beliefs. Saint Vitus and the sacred curse. To understand how the people of Strasbourg interpreted the dancing plague, you have to understand who Saint Vitus was and what he meant to them. Saint Vitus was a Christian martyr of the 3rd century A.D., a child, according to legend, who converted to Christianity and was tortured for his faith. He was associated with protection from, and sometimes the causing of, uncontrollable movement. For centuries before 1518, across Germany and the surrounding regions, there had been outbreaks of what people called Saint Vitus's dance. Groups of pilgrims who, while traveling to or from sacred shrines, would erupt into involuntary movement, who would dance and convulse and weep until exhausted, who then, often, recovered.
These outbreaks were not new. They stretched back at least to the 14th century. The 1374 outbreak, which swept through towns along the Rhine River, is one of the most documented. Thousands of people dancing, crossing town lines, drawing others in, and then, eventually, stopping. This history gave the people of Strasbourg a framework, a terrifying one, but a framework nonetheless. Saint Vitus had been offended, or Saint Vitus was testing them. A pilgrimage, prayer, ritual, these were the tools available. These were the responses that made sense within their world. And so some of the afflicted were sent on pilgrimages, to the chapel at Saverne, to other shrines. Some reportedly recovered after these journeys, some did not. Some collapsed on the road and never danced again, for a different reason entirely.
The devil in the movement. Not everyone agreed that Saint Vitus was responsible. In the theological debates of the early 16th century, remember, this is just 1 year after Martin Luther nailed his theses to a church door, there were those who saw the dancing as demonic. Demonic possession was a fully credible medical and spiritual diagnosis in 1518. The Church had detailed frameworks for identifying and treating it, and the dancing, involuntary, uncontrollable, driven by some invisible force, fit the profile disturbingly well. Eyewitnesses described dancers with eyes rolled back, mouths stretched open, bodies contorted in ways that seemed, to observers, inhuman. There were accounts of dancers crying out in voices that didn't sound like their own, of dancers laughing and weeping simultaneously in a way that no one could explain. Exorcisms were attempted, prayers were offered over the afflicted, holy water, relics, the full spiritual arsenal of a medieval Catholic city was deployed against the dancing. And for some, perhaps through the power of belief, it may have helped. But here's the question that haunted Strasbourg's priests and physicians alike. If this was demonic possession, why were so many people possessed at once? Why had the devil chosen this city, this summer, these particular people? And why did the possession look so much like grief? The human cost. By September 1518, the outbreak was beginning to slow. The music was stopped, the guild halls were closed, the stage was dismantled. The city council reversed its disastrous decision to encourage the dancing with musicians. Gradually, over days and weeks, the dances stopped. Some recovered completely. Some were left with lasting injuries, ruined feet, damaged hearts, exhausted bodies that would never quite work the same way again. Some died in the final days of the outbreak, too far gone to recover even after the dancing ceased. The total death toll is difficult to establish with certainty. Historical records are fragmentary, but most historians who study this episode estimate that the Strasbourg dancing plague of 1518 killed dozens of people. Some estimates go higher. In a city of perhaps 20,000 souls, it was a visible, devastating, and deeply traumatizing event. And then it was over, and Strasbourg tried to move on. But the question remained, the question that would echo across 5 centuries. What happened? What actually made 400 people dance until they died? The theories. Modern historians and scientists have proposed several major theories to explain the Strasbourg dancing plague. Some are compelling, some are strange, some are deeply uncomfortable, and none of them, not one, explains everything. Let's go through them.
Theory 1. Ergot poisoning. The first theory involves a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, better known as ergot. And if you've never heard of ergot before, Hold on, because this might be the most unsettling biological substance you've ever learned about. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. It thrives in cold, wet winters, followed by warm springs, exactly the climactic conditions present in the Rhine Valley in the years leading up to 1518. And ergot contains, among other things, a chemical compound that you will absolutely recognize. Ergot is the natural precursor to LSD. Ergot poisoning, ergotism, has two forms. The first causes constriction of blood vessels, leading to gangrene. The second, called convulsive ergotism, attacks the nervous system. It causes hallucinations, spasms, convulsions, uncontrollable movement. The theory is straightforward. If the grain supplies of Strasbourg in the summer of 1518 were contaminated with ergot, which they very plausibly could have been, then the bread that poor people ate daily could have been slowly poisoning them, causing exactly the neurological symptoms that looked to observers like involuntary dancing. It's a compelling theory. Ergot poisoning is well documented in history. The Salem witch trials of 1692 have been partly attributed to ergot contamination. There are outbreaks across medieval Europe that historians have retroactively identified as ergotism. But here's the problem. Ergotism doesn't work like that. Convulsive ergotism doesn't produce rhythmic, dance-like movement. It produces seizures, chaotic, uncontrolled, unpredictable, not the synchronized, repetitive motion that contemporary witnesses specifically described. And ergotism would have affected entire families, entire districts, based on shared grain supplies, not the way the Strasbourg outbreak spread, person to person, observer to observer. Ergot is a seductive answer, but it probably isn't the right one. Theory 2. Actual physical disease. Could there have been an actual neurological disease involved? Some historians and medical researchers have explored whether the dancing plague could be explained by Sydenham's chorea, a real neurological disorder characterized by involuntary, irregular movements, often triggered by infection. Sydenham's chorea, which was historically called St. Vitus's dance, causes jerky, uncontrolled movements of the limbs and face. It's associated with streptococcal infections, and it primarily affects children and adolescents, though adults can be affected too. A streptococcal epidemic moving through a malnourished, weakened population, triggering mass neurological symptoms, it's not impossible. Strasbourg in 1518 was exactly the kind of environment where infectious disease could spread rapidly and hit hard. But again, the details don't quite fit. Sydenham's chorea doesn't spread at the rate the Strasbourg outbreak spread. It doesn't explain why the dancing followed the social pattern it followed, why some who watched the dancers for long periods then began dancing themselves. Physical disease can explain some of what happened, but not all of it, not even most of it. And this brings us to the theory that most modern historians and psychologists find most convincing. The theory that, frankly, is the most interesting and the most disturbing. Mass psychogenic illness, also called mass hysteria, though both of those terms are somewhat misleading, and we'll come back to why. The idea is this. Under conditions of extreme stress, fear, and social pressure, human beings can develop real physical symptoms, symptoms that have no direct organic cause, that then spread from person to person through observation, through suggestion, through shared belief. This is not fringe science.
Mass psychogenic illness is a well-documented, thoroughly researched phenomenon. It has happened in modern times, in the 1980s in multiple American schools, in Kosovo in the 1990s during the brutal ethnic conflict there, in Leroy, New York in 2011, where a group of teenagers simultaneously developed Tourette's-like symptoms with no physical cause. The key features of mass psychogenic illness are remarkably consistent across history and across cultures. It tends to strike communities already under extreme stress. It tends to affect the most vulnerable members of those communities first. It spreads through close observation, and it resolves, almost always, once the underlying stress is removed or once the community is given a way to understand and process what is happening to them. Does that sound familiar? A city of the desperately poor, famine, plague, economic desperation. A woman who begins dancing, and then others who watch her begin dancing too. A population that has a pre-existing cultural and religious framework for this kind of episode. St. Vitus, sacred choreography, the pilgrim's dance. The historian John Waller, who has written the most comprehensive modern account of the Strasbourg dancing plague, argues powerfully for this interpretation. His 2008 book, A Time to Dance, A Time to Die, is the definitive modern treatment of the outbreak. And his central argument is this: the dancing plague of Strasbourg in 1518 was a collective psychological response to collective trauma. Real symptoms, real suffering, real deaths. But the trigger was not a fungus or a bacterium. The trigger was despair. The role of belief. There's one more element of the mass psychogenic theory that is crucial to understanding how it worked, and it comes down to belief. For the people of Strasbourg in 1518, St. Vitus's dance was real, not a metaphor, not a superstition, a real, documented, recognized phenomenon with a history stretching back over a century. There were precedents, there were stories, there were pilgrims who had been struck by it and recovered, there were communities that had experienced it before. When Frau Trophia began dancing, the people around her had a ready-made explanation, and that explanation, psychologists now understand, can itself become a mechanism of spread. If you already believe that St. Vitus can strike you with uncontrollable dancing, and you are already under enormous psychological pressure, and you witness someone dancing, the suggestion alone can trigger your own body to produce real symptoms. This is not weakness. This is not stupidity. This is the human nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do. Responding to environmental cues, synchronizing with social signals, expressing through the body what the mind cannot otherwise process. The poor of Strasbourg in 1518 were not foolish or primitive. They were people at the absolute edge of what human beings can endure, and their bodies expressed that in the only language available to them: the dance.
Modern perspective. It's happened since. Here is where this story stops being safely historical. Here is where it reaches through 500 years and touches something in the present. Mass psychogenic illness did not end in the 16th century. It didn't end in the medieval period. It has continued steadily, reliably, right up to today. In 2006, an outbreak of twitching and fainting spread through 300 students at a high school in Portugal, triggered, investigators believe, by an episode of a popular TV show depicting similar symptoms. The students saw it. Their bodies replicated it. Real symptoms, no physical cause.
In 2012, in a small town in Colombia, dozens of teenage girls were hospitalized with convulsions, fainting, and involuntary movement. Cameras arrived. More girls developed symptoms. When authorities tried to explain it as psychosomatic, the community rejected the explanation, and the rejection itself prolonged the outbreak. And then there is the digital age. In 2020 and 2021, researchers documented a significant rise in tic disorders, particularly among teenage girls, that appeared to be spreading through TikTok. Young people who had never had tics before were developing Tourette's-like symptoms after watching creators with similar symptoms. The researchers called it a functional tic-like behavior, a modern manifestation of exactly the same phenomenon that filled the streets of Strasbourg in 1518. The mechanism is identical: observation, stress, suggestion, a population under pressure, a behavior that spreads because the mind and body are not as separate as we like to think. 500 years. The technology changed, the clothing changed, the language changed, but the fundamental vulnerability of the human nervous system under stress, that hasn't changed at all. What psychology has learned. Modern neuroimaging has actually begun to show us what is happening in the brain during psychogenic illness, and the findings are remarkable. The symptoms are real. The brain activity that produces uncontrolled movement in someone with conversion disorder, the clinical term for psychogenic physical symptoms, looks different from simulated movement. The body is genuinely doing something it cannot consciously control. The person is not faking. They are not choosing. Their nervous system has been, in some sense, hijacked. Researchers who study trauma have found that the body holds experience in ways that the conscious mind does not, that extreme stress and grief and fear can encode themselves in the nervous system and emerge as physical symptoms, movement disorders, paralysis, blindness, seizures that have no lesion, no tumor, no clear biological cause, but are entirely, devastatingly real. The people of Strasbourg were not mentally ill in any simplistic sense. They were people whose bodies were expressing, in the only way available, the magnitude of what they had endured and what they feared. The famine, the plague, the grinding poverty, the deaths of children, the deaths of neighbors, the terror of a world that seemed to be ending. The dance was the grief made visible. What still isn't known. But here is the honest truth about the Strasbourg dancing plague of 1518. We still don't know exactly what happened, not with certainty. The mass psychogenic illness theory is compelling. It fits most of the evidence. It aligns with what we know from modern cases, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't fully account for the specific, rhythmic quality of the movement that witnesses described. It doesn't explain every individual case in the historical record. Some researchers still leave room for a neurological component, some trigger, biological or chemical, that interacted with the psychological and social factors to produce something uniquely catastrophic, a perfect storm. What historians agree on is this: the Strasbourg dancing plague of 1518 was real. People suffered, people died. The suffering was genuine, the deaths were genuine, and the event was not a hoax, not an exaggeration, not a metaphor. Something happened in that city, in that summer, to those people, and 500 years later, we are still trying to understand it. The most unsettling realization. Here is the part I've been saving. The part that when I first encountered it made me sit back from my desk and stare at nothing for a while.
If the mass psychogenic theory is correct, if the Strasbourg dancing plague was, fundamentally, a collective psychological response to collective trauma, then we have to sit with an uncomfortable question. Not what caused the dancing, but why it took that form. Why dancing specifically? Why did the mind and body of Strasbourg's poor in the summer of 1518 express their anguish through movement, through a behavior that looks from the outside almost like joy? John Waller's answer to this question is the one that has stayed with me the longest. He argues that the dancing spread the way it did and took the form it did partly because of the legend of St. Vitus, because the people of Strasbourg already had a template, a story they'd been told, a sacred narrative about dancers who could not stop. And here is the terrible irony at the heart of this story. The very belief system that gave these people a way to understand their suffering, the story of St. Vitus, the tradition of the sacred dance, may have been the same belief system that created the conditions for the outbreak in the first place. The story made the symptoms possible. The culture provided the script, and 500 people performed it in their bodies with devastating consequences. Which means, and follow me here, it could have been a different story. In a different culture with a different set of sacred narratives, the same suffering might have expressed itself differently. In a different symptom, a different behavior, a different collective response to the same intolerable pressure. We don't dance in the streets until we die, not usually, but we do have our own stories, our own templates, our own shared narratives about how suffering looks and behaves and spreads. And we live, right now, in an era of unprecedented psychological pressure, of loneliness, of information overload, of economic anxiety, of a global pandemic that reshaped everything, transmitted through digital systems capable of spreading behavioral templates to millions of people in seconds. The Strasbourg dancing plague of 1518 is not a medieval curiosity. It is not a relic of a more superstitious, less rational age. It is a mirror. It is a demonstration, clear, documented, terrifying, of what the human nervous system does when it is pushed far enough. Frau Trophia stepped into that alley in July 1518 and began to dance. And the world around her, the suffering, frightened, desperate world she lived in, danced with her. Because that's what worlds do when the pressure becomes unbearable and the story is already written and all that's left is to move. The dancing stopped eventually. It always stops. But the conditions that created it, those never really go away. The documents from the Strasbourg dancing plague are preserved in the archives of the city and urban community of Strasbourg. They include official council records, physician reports, and a handful of first-hand witness accounts. They are written in a mixture of Latin and early modern German. Some have never been fully translated into English. The people who wrote them were doing what human beings have always done when confronted with something they cannot explain. They were trying to make it make sense. They were trying to build a story around the chaos. They didn't entirely succeed. Neither have we. Some questions are patient. They can wait centuries for an answer. Some answers, when they finally arrive, only open into deeper questions.